But I refuse to assume that now we're on the right track. Now, I mean, it's the same narrative, right? Jesus is back. He is going to save us. We're constantly looking out for where's the savior. For some, it's Donald Trump. He's the savior. He's going to make everything better. My question is, when are you going to make everything better? We may not have a national platform and access with our finger on the pulse of the government. And I've said this all the time, though. You have access to your family, you have access to your local community. I think that's where our responsibility lies. We have a responsibility to make sure we're better informed, that we're better prepared, and that we're leading the life we want to lead. And that's hard, as they say in the Gnostic texts. Man was thrown out of the garden and thrown in a state of chaos, so he would not be occupied. He could no longer be bothered by matters of the Holy Spirit. We're distracted from that inner voice. That's why I said remote viewing is not a gift, it's our birthright, but we have forgotten about that birthright.
I started writing Food for the Archons as a book of despair after watching my father die in 2013. During his transition, I experienced a series of paranormal and psychic events that left me feeling that I had either gone completely crazy or fell into humanity's darkest secret. I spent the next 5 years conducting extensive research, and I quickly learned that what I had experienced was real. My journey brought me to an understanding that showed me that despite the terrifying reality of an unseen predator, we as humans have a forgotten power. Just knowing this brings us tremendous hope in what once seemed a dark reality. I wrote this book for me in hopes of gaining a better understanding of our reality and relationship to it. But my hope is that you will find as much value in reading it as I did in writing it. I Am Human, Food for the Archons, humanity's psychic connections, simulated realities, parallel worlds, and the manipulation of mankind. It's available on Amazon.com and at sixcentsmedia.net and wherever books are sold. I'm Dennis Nappy II, reminding you to let your intuition be your guide. Thank you.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong in the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there.
Unpacking the conspiracy. It seems as if we are not alone and are finally getting public acknowledgement from government and former government officials that they have in fact been involved in the investigation of UAP or UFO phenomenon. What does that mean for us? Why is this coming out into the public now? When I think back to when I was a kid in the 80s and 90s, UFO stuff was something that you really didn't talk about publicly. And it's interesting when you look at the progression of how things have gone. Back when I was a kid, obviously Whitley Strieber's book was the big one, but that was for a very small niche of people who were interested in it. We then had the movie Communion, starring Christopher Walken. We had, some of the made-for-TV movies that came out. The Intruders being one of them, with Deb Cobble, who was a fascinating woman that I had an opportunity to speak with. It was just this gradual introduction of like, hey, this might be out there, but it's okay to say that these people are crazy. You then had the X-Files, which really began to bring it into mainstream focus, but again, still as a work of fiction. When I really started to think there was something going on here in terms of, if you want to look at the idea of a gradual introduction of a new concept to larger society, I'd say it was Ancient Aliens. Ancient Aliens, when it first came out, I remember being floored by it because it was on a channel that I looked at as very credible, as the History Channel. It was History 2, they labeled it, so it's not quite the History Channel, right? But they proposed these theories, and the first season was looking at von Daniken's work, Chariots of the Gods, and this, how could these. What's neat about von Daniken is he asked a lot of questions, right? Questions that we normally accept of it must have been humans. We just haven't figured out fully how they built these ancient structures and did all these things. But they really got the public questioning about things in terms of what happened in the past and were we alone? Are we alone? And then we flash forward to 2017 and we have the To the Stars Academy coming out and we have with Tom DeLonge, with Lou Elizondo, Chris Mellon, Hal Puthoff's involved in that, and the New York Times article talking about UAPs and these government programs that were looking into that. Senator Harry Reid, who was secretly running this and getting funding for it, some ties to Skinwalker Ranch, some of the Bigelow stuff. It all started to come out in 2017, but it wasn't this. It was a blurry video of the Tic Tac radar. Basically, no, the radar wasn't blurry, but it was the confirmation of the Tic Tac video. And then gradually, we've had more and more people coming out. Now we've got David Grush. Now we have Skywatchers coming out as well, talking about these psionics. So this story is continuing to evolve here in a very gradual fashion. When you take a step back and you look at it, it's not this shock and awe. It looks more like a gradual conditioning of people to accept what's happening, to accept that we may not be alone and something may be going on. Hal Puthoff was just on the Joe Rogan show within the past month, and I want to talk a little bit about Hal's work, that conversation he had with Joe Rogan. But I want to backpedal and talk about in 2017. I did a lot of podcasts talking about this. I was very excited about this when this came out. And I remember, if you can find the show, I remember Tucker Carlson on Fox News he was one of the first journalists on the mainstream platform to cover this. And I was so excited. And as I'm watching this interview, and I'm like, man, I got a lot of respect. This guy's, he's putting it out there. And I remember at the end of my podcast, really breaking down his conversation, getting mad at Tucker. Not that I know the guy, because it was very obvious to me there was questions he was not asking. As a journalist, and I'll say this as someone who is an investigator, an experienced investigator, there's questions that come up. Journalists are investigators. And there was very specific questions the man wasn't asking. Very simple questions that come across any good investigator's mind that he was not asking, was not bringing up, was not addressing. One of them being, who's piloting the craft? And that question never came up. The other one being, man, over the years, we've had thousands upon thousands of people claiming to have been abducted by these beings in these crafts. Is there a connection? Should we interview some of these people? Even though people label them crackpots and kooks, there are also a high number of people out there who are what we call credible witnesses, expert witnesses, police officers, military personnel, educated people. And I'm not downplaying anybody who has claimed to have had an encounter. But when you have somebody with strong credentials, it makes for a much better argument that there is something real that's happening. So anyway, I was very frustrated with Tucker at that point, and it showed me that, okay, well, this is coming out, but obviously we definitely don't have a free press, and he's towing the line on the talking points he was probably given. However, Tucker got fired. He's now got his own platform, and I say this with respect, he's unleashed. He can say or ask whatever he wants, or at least that's the perception. Let's keep our conspiracy brain in there, right? Maybe he's still under the thumb of somebody, but he's a lot more free to ask a lot of bigger questions. And I'm going to talk about two interviews he did with two, I think, significant people towards the end of this podcast. One by a woman by the name of Catherine Fitz, who has made some very powerful comments about the economy, which ties into a lot of the work we do with future forecasting. And the other one he had on the line was Senator Kurt Weldon. To talk about another credible person who made some very damning statements about what happened on 9/11. So you want to talk about unpacking a conspiracy. So I initially wanted this show to be about strictly Hal Puthoff and UFOs and UAPs. But I think between those two interviews that Tucker did, the Joe Rogan conversation with Hal Puthoff, I want to try to take a broader view as well in just understanding that conspiracies, I'll use that word right now because it's a popular word. Conspiracies are real. And there are several big ones that are coming out right now. And maybe this is my conclusion talk, but I'm going to go with it. And I don't think the timing of it is an accident. That's really what I want my big takeaway to be from this conversation. I don't think it's an accident because we also have President Trump right now who's in office who is dismantling things and exposing certain things. And I think after hearing all of this stuff over the last couple of weeks, President Trump is a symptom of everything that has been happening. All of this, all of this, all these lies, all this corruption, all these acts of treason, all of these people who have been suffering in a variety of different ways. I fear that we may feel that we are waking up. We may feel that we are finally going to take the power back. But I think it's just another layer of manipulation when you look at, in my opinion, how strategically everything is being rolled out, how perfectly timed it is. So my big question for all of us to consider as we continue to go through this and celebrate these tiny victories of information that we may receive, was this intended? Are we still, as we are having these awakenings, are we being awakened by the very system we're trying to escape from? It's a lot to think about, but I want us to hold that question in our mind as I go through some of my thoughts on what I've watched and learned over the past. So I'll start just with my thoughts on the Hal Puthoff interview. Hal Puthoff was on Joe Rogan's podcast, one of the biggest podcasts in the world. And if you're not familiar with Hal Puthoff, those of us in the remote viewing community know the name very well. Hal Puthoff is one of the parents of remote viewing. He was a researcher at Stanford, at the Stanford Research Institute, and he was one of the lead scientists, lead researchers responsible for helping to use the scientific method to understand communication beyond the five senses in a way that developed into remote viewing, ultimately training people to create a structure, a protocol, using Ingo Swann. Russell Targ was involved, and many other known credible psychics to build this structure to gather information beyond the five senses. His work at SRI was contracted out to the CIA, to the Department of Defense, to the military. And this was, became government-run programs, government-run experiments. And then eventually in 1997 was declassified, and you started to see these military-trained viewers going out into the civilian world and training people who were interested in it, which, obviously is the product of that lineage, that story. And many of you out there are getting that training as well. So to listen to him go through and talk about things and all of the things that he's been involved in and how scientifically minded he is, and hear him talk about things like UFOs and UAPs. He referenced a paper that he published in, I think, 2022. And it's a paper titled Ultraterrestrial Models. Let's try that again. Say that 3 times fast. And this was published in the Journal of Cosmology, volume 29, number 1. It's written by Hal Puthoff. And the abstract of this, I'm just going to read you the abstract. Under consideration in this paper are 2 seminal statements, and they're I can't read this word, concomitants currently unknown as follows. Number 1, there is an unidentified phenomenon interacting with the current human population on Earth. An unidentified phenomenon acting with the human population on Earth. Okay, we can interpret that a bunch of different ways. Obviously, we're thinking UFOs, aliens, or whatever. But still, it could be anything. It could be some strange weather anomaly, right? Number 2, He clarifies even further, it is currently unknown whether the phenomenon is exclusively extraterrestrial, extra dimensional, crypto terrestrial, demonic or jinn, proto ancient human, time travelers, etc., or some combination or mutation of any or all of these. However, it appears highly likely that the phenomena per se is not constituted exclusively of members of the current human population. What a smart way to word that. It's not members of the current human population. And he listed all of the big theories in the conspiracy theory realm, which, it's an acknowledgement that, hey, there's something going on. We really don't know what it is, but it's important to take note of that we are being interacted with. And what does that mean? That could be a variety of different things, obviously. But it is from it's not an official government acknowledgement, but it's an acknowledgement for someone who's been there, who has talked to the people, who has worked in so many different ways. He's also received recovered materials, some of which he was able to talk about on the Joe Rogan podcast, some of which was too classified for him to even get into at all. But he has received materials that we are incapable of making at this point in time. I look at what remote viewing, the potential remote viewing has. And I want to say something like remote viewing is really a gift to humanity, but that doesn't feel appropriate to me. I think I've received it as a gift, but I do feel that it's more of our birthright. We've just forgotten about it. But Hal Puthoff is one of the people who helped facilitate bringing that back to us. It's very obvious to me that Hal is, and I mean this with respect, Hal is playing by the rules in terms of what he can and what he can't say. I don't know how he feels fully on. Well, actually, he talked about this with Joe Rogan in terms of releasing things openly to the public and giving them everything. He was part of some government think tanks where they were asking, if we had information, what impact would this have on the public? And I believe you have to listen to the Joe Rogan interview, but I believe what this think tank of top scientists in the world came up with was that it would be a very devastating event for the public if it was to come out as like, hey, UFO landed on the White House lawn. Either way, he plays by the rules, and I don't fault him for that because he has an opportunity to continue to do this kind of research, to have access to this information. And I think to some extent we all play by the rules. I think sometimes in our minds we want to be the hero and the whistleblower and want to say, oh, these people have this information and why don't they just share it with all of us? I think that's the challenge with something like disclosure is nobody really knows, and this is what Tucker Carlson's interview got into with Catherine Fitz. Nobody really knows who's completely in charge. We do suspect that there's these shadow elements out there. And with topics like this, stepping out and pulling an Edward Snowden is a very dangerous thing. It sounds like people have been killed over this. Congressman Kurt Weldon, I think I referred to him as Senator earlier, my apologies. Congressman Kurt Weldon out of Pennsylvania, he made a statement, and he was in line to become I believe the chair of the Arms Committee. He was very involved in the intelligence world. He was a very well connected congressman. When he's talking with Tucker Carlson, it was very evident. He was saying and from what I gather from this interview, he has not made any statements that were untrue in terms of what he can prove with hard evidence. I believe what the man was saying about all of this. But one of the things he said is that this is surrounding the 9/11 conspiracy, that there is the capability to give fast moving cancer to people. And he alluded to, he says, I can't prove this. All I can say is that, it's an odd timing or something like that. Certain people that had access to certain information and were taking certain steps suddenly died of fast moving cancer. Stephen Greer has made that comment in the past. And if you're familiar with Carla Turner, who was a UFO researcher and becoming a loud voice in the UFO circuit, she died of a mysterious fast moving cancer. So the stakes are high. I understand why there's a line they won't cross. There's lines I won't cross. I mean, that's just the honest truth of it. And I think every one of us has that threshold. And I think that we'll call it the system because I don't know that I don't think that there's one dictator who's saying, tell him, don't tell him. I think there's a system with so many checks and balances and cogs and wheels. One hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. And I don't know that there is a large population that really does have the whole picture, which makes things even harder to, it keeps everybody confused. And you can apply that to the UFO disclosure. You can apply that to what Catherine Fitz is saying about the financial system and the system of control that's descending upon us. You can apply it to the 9/11 conspiracy. And I'll talk about the 9/11 conspiracy for a moment. When 9/11 happened, I was in the army. I was a newly trained counterintelligence agent, and when those planes hit, I was like, "Oh, that's got to be Bin Laden." But it was such an emotional, scary thing, and the story was strong. These terrorists did it. We knew that there was terrorism. We knew that there was Islamic extremism. So the story was easy to accept for me. I was a 21-year-old kid. And as a soldier, you want to create the enemy, you want to identify who the enemy is, and that's who you focus on. And I've talked on this show before about dogma and our belief system. And there's certain things we just don't question. Yeah, that's the enemy. They did it. It makes sense. Why would I question that? My government told me that's what happened. I trust in my government because I work for the government. I'm a part of the government, and I believe in the United States of America, red, white, and blue. Blah 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 blah. I just accepted everything. And then a few years later, someone close to me told me 9/11 was an inside job. And I got pissed off, man. I got pissed because, well, now you're attacking me. I was an intelligence agent, and you're saying that my people, my brethren, people that swore the same oath that I swore, had knowledge of this and would hurt the American people. And cognitive dissonance kicked in hard, man. And I was furious. Don't ever bring that up to me again. And then as time goes on, things start to come out. Tower 7 is a big one. Watching Tower 7 come down doesn't make any sense. The fact that the FBI within a day recovered several passports and clothing articles of the alleged terrorists from the planes that crashed into the building in a fiery ball of flames, suddenly flew out of the guy's pockets, through the plane, dodged the flames, went out the windows of the towers before they were pulverized into dust, and landed on top of the rubble where FBI agents happened to find it. They couldn't find any. There were no papers that survived. They couldn't find bodies. They were finding fragments of bodies, and you're going to tell me passports survived? So there's a lot of things that don't add up. And I'll be honest, I never spoke about not in great length, my questions, my concerns, because number one, of what my reaction was. Number two, I know people who lost people in the towers. I know how emotional it was. And I felt, what am I going to do anyway? I'm just going to be another, quote, conspiracy theorist. I don't have any special access to information. I know Dick and Daz have published initially at their time at Farsight, but they published more information through future forecasting from a project they worked years ago about 9/11, and it tells a very different story. My bigger point here is on this podcast, I've talked about things like the Milgram experiment. I've talked a lot about social control, psychological operations, and manipulation. I think 2 or 3 podcasts ago, I talked about that. And we all want to sit here and say, not me. I will not fall for it. I will not become a sheep. I will not move with the herd. I will stand up. I will do the right thing. But I think we comply all the time. When I really listened to what Congressman Kurt Weldon was saying on Tucker Carlson, it's infuriating. It's an acknowledgement by a former government congressman with high access that treason happened and there was advanced knowledge of 9/11 and they allowed it to happen and possibly helped orchestrate it. It's infuriating. And I think the question is, with that knowledge, what can a guy like me do about it? What can all of us do about it? We don't even know who is really responsible. Even if someone was to name names, that's on law enforcement, right? But what happens when your law enforcement is corrupted? What happens if your leaders in these federal agencies are in on it or are corrupted? What do you do? Who do you turn to? How do you identify this? Because it's buried so deep. So we go about our lives going, oh, there's a conspiracy theory. Yeah, that sounds about accurate. And that's it. But then you remember back to that day and how awful it was and the impact that had and the things that came out from that, like the Patriot Act, all the surveillance that came upon the American people and the world. We let it happen and we continue to allow things to happen because it's so gradual, it's so subtle, and then we're manipulated in a way, we're manipulated into silence, we're manipulated into compliance. And that's not everybody. Me, someone who feels that I speak up pretty regularly in my personal life, my professional life, and obviously on this platform, it took me a while to get to this point. And I'm no Alex Jones who will scream about everything. But it's scary because what is it that we're not seeing that we are still complying with? The UAP thing. It's very obvious to me that there's something going on. It's very obvious to me that we are being influenced. I don't know if it's good or bad, but we're being visited and interacted with by some other intelligence. And that is potentially detrimental to us. But what can we do about it? That's why I think the conspiracy runs very deep. Whitley Strieber had a guest on his show Dreamland on his podcast. Um, I think his name was Eric Nanstel. I'm going to play a clip from his conversation, and he said something I think that's potentially very concerning about what this experience might be. So let me share this and let you listen to the clip here.
Well, I think, based on my experiences and what I've heard, they're breeding themselves a replacement species for Homo sapiens sapiens that will be neurologically compatible so they can basically take their brains, their minds, their memories, their experiences, and place them in human hybrids and become compatible with living here on Earth on the surface. I think it's a very slow, calculated invasion of it. It starts as an infestation and then a replacement. So at some point, Homo sapiens sapiens would have to be phased out, like we phased out Neanderthals. Or was that us? I don't know. I think they aim to replace us, and they stepped up their schedule when we started lighting off nuclear bombs in the 40s.
Wow. I'm kind of gobsmacked.
Well,
it's an awesome theory. I have to tell you that. I don't know if it's correct or any of the theories are correct, but that's one of the most interesting ones I've ever heard.
Okay. Sorry, still playing. So obviously, that's not what Whitley puts out on his show. Because he's had such a relationship with these visitors that has terrified him, but inspired so much growth in him as well. But I think we need to keep our minds open. I mean, what this guy is saying ties into the work of Grant Cameron, talking about not Grant Cameron. I'm sorry, Dr. Jacobs talking about the hybrids and this again, this gradual takeover. And I think this is you guys know my feelings on this. I also think that there is an AI component to this, and that takeover aspect would make sense. I'm not saying that's what's happening. I'm saying that's a possibility. Maybe we are gradually being upgraded. Maybe our maybe these beings, they say the Greys, there's lots of reports of lots of different races, but they think that the Greys are some kind of android. But and let's put this whole big picture together, right? This whole conspiracy. But what if we are looking at the Greys are future versions of ourselves? Something changes, and ultimately we end up evolving into these, putting our consciousness into the minds of these beings that are engineered bodies. And they say that they have a collective. So if we end up having some kind of hive mind that we can then disperse to all these little gray bodies that go out and do their work, maybe that's what happens in the future. And now they're saying, well, we want to come back. We want to come back and re-inhabit this planet and maybe do things differently. If you start to understand and look at time and space, and possibly it's changeable, or possibly we can divert and create different timelines. Maybe that's the bigger piece. That's what's happening. How would we get there? Well, we start putting technology in our brains, and we're moving in that direction with things like Neuralink. I think that that logic can work in terms of, well, we put chips in our brain and gradually become more and more symbiotic and reliant on technology until we fully understand consciousness. And then we decide, okay, consciousness doesn't need this human meat suit at some point. So we're now going to evolve into the Greys, and the Greys are going to say, hey, this is who we are now. And oh man, this sucks. We don't like this. We've understand time travel. And now we're going to go back and we're going to really try to get into the human body before the technology takes over and turns us into this. I don't know. I know that sounds like a crazy theory, but I don't think we should take anything off the table right now. And let's tie in the other piece that I wanted to talk about on the show is what Catherine Fitz talked about with Tucker Carlson. It was fascinating to listen to this woman, who again is another credible former government employee with inside knowledge. She worked for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And what she was, one of the many things she talked about is how she identified a way to basically get cheaper housing for everybody, and work with the money a lot better. And the establishment stepped in, was pretty much like, no, and I think they fired her or ran her out, or yeah, they did. They came after her. They tried to discredit her. They took out her money. A lot of bad things happened to that woman. As she's starting to identify, follow the money, some corruption, and how money is being misallocated and not appropriately given. I'm a product of, and I'm a advocate for, and someone who's worked for the public school system over the last 15, 20 years. And I've seen firsthand, my first book was I tried to be a quote whistleblower with my first book, but it didn't get any attention because I didn't know what to do with it. But when I stepped into those inner city schools in Philadelphia, and saw what was happening, I was terrified. I recognized that education was being intentionally watered down and dismantled. I recognized that the inner cities were being disproportionately underfunded and money was being misdirected. I recognized that the lieutenants of this, not all, but some of these lieutenants, I will say, the frontline leaders, the low level leaders, were the principals of the schools. Corruption was rampant. And that's not every principal. I worked with some amazing principals in Philly, but I also saw some who were obviously lying about things, which is why I got run out of one of my schools, because I kept bringing it up. I kept pointing things out, and they didn't like that. But I saw parallels between the way the youth were being treated and the opportunities that are then created for the youth in terms of extremism and extremist thought. was very similar to the model that I saw when I was overseas as a counterintelligence agent, in how Islamic extremists were recruiting young people to become martyrs, suicide bombers, freedom fighters, whatever. And when I released my book, one of the things I was talking about, I was trying to go to police departments, was saying, get in the schools. You need to change your image, law enforcement, because as a former cop, I recognize there are so many wonderful men and women in uniform whose hearts are in the right place, who have a very hard, very dangerous job to do. You're trained to think tactically. You're trained to think, how could someone hurt me? Because cops get killed every day trying to help people. But the perception is that you are these bad, horrible monsters, and the arm of the government designed to keep people down, especially in certain communities. You're racially targeting people. Again, that's the perception. And this is no secret. That doesn't mean that's reality, but that's the perception. What I was trying to say was, like, you got to get in the schools and you got to change this, because every one of my kids I talked to, when they found out that I was a cop, we'd have conversations about it, and they hated the police. But they all had a reason why. Yeah, the police came in and they took my dad. Yeah, the police came in and they beat the crap out of so and so. Like, they all had very specific stories surrounding traumatic events. And that's not saying that the law enforcement officer wasn't justified in the arrest they made or the use of force. I don't know the whole story, but it points to, well, now you've got this generation of kids who have seen from their perspective my parent or my loved one be harmed by someone in uniform who was being very aggressive. And that's an easy target to then bring an extremist in and say, hey, you want to get back at them? You want to bring about change? You want to stand up for your rights? You're entitled to this stuff. Look how they're keeping you down. Go fight the system. And I remember looking at that as an indicator that it's only a matter of time before police officers start getting actually targeted and shot. And within a few months of my book coming out, we had the first targeted assassination in Las Vegas with two officers sitting in a restaurant. And I don't think that was an inner city kid, but my point is, we saw this narrative that was building. And I think Alex Jones was even talking about, things like the police state and things of that nature. And I wholeheartedly believe law enforcement needed to and needs to change. But it's not just law enforcement. We don't have enough support in social services. I can't tell you how many, with just my small community, how many students I've worked with that are in desperate need of strong mental health services, and they're told, well, there's a wait list. You need this immediately. You are in danger, but there's a wait list. Or the quality of help they get is absolute crap. I have seen, as a cop, as a teacher, as a citizen of the United States, I've seen the mental health system fail so many times. I believe they failed me multiple times. There is so much disorganization. There is a system that is stressed and taxed and overwhelmed, which leads from the employees who are trying to help people and serve people, and probably got into this for good reasons, it leads to a state of apathy. And then you have an overburdened system of people who are just festering and trying to find their way. So I know I'm going on all these tangents here, but if you go back and I encourage you to, if you're not familiar with David Icke's work, his early lectures, which were anywhere from like 5 to 10 hours long. If you can find them on YouTube, or if you can read his books, I'm not saying that you have to come to the same conclusion that there's a hidden reptilian agenda, existing on the planet. But when you recognize, he's big on the term dot connecting, how interconnected everything is, how everything is tied in. And that's what I was seeing, because I was really into David Icke when I was a young teacher. I was recognizing how the education piece ties to the social services piece, ties to, well, these are our future voters, these are our future citizens, and we're making them more ignorant. We're making them more dependent on technology to tell them what to think, to socially engineer them. There's this whole big structure in place right now. And you really start to see that. And now, while everybody's mad about everything, and then you end up with someone like Donald Trump. How does that happen? Because there have been so many systemic failures, and everybody was just so sick and tired of the old way. Not everybody, half the American population. And I'm not saying pro or against. That's a dangerous conversation to have, and I don't think we need to get into that. I'm just saying systemically, I think there are so many failures right now, which where does that lead us to? I talked about, I think it was on the Future Forecast platform. Sorry, I get them confused sometimes. But on this platform, I did a powerful interview, one of the most significant interviews of my life with Edward Reardon about his Q sessions. And in that session, he said at some point they're going to realize the fallibility and this was his opinion. It wasn't him. I don't think this was remote viewing data. He says it's possible to see they'll recognize the fallibility of the human mind, of human leaders, because there'll be so many failures. AI is going to run things. AI is going to govern things because it will understand everything and it'll make these sound choices that are in the best interest of everybody. Are we continuing to be led to that outcome? I think it's highly possible. I I don't want to take the mindset. I hear people say things like, well, good will always win over evil. Will it? Because we have a lot of instances here in the world where good has not won. I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm trying to be real. There have been a lot of instances where good has not won. And I think that I'm reducing things when I say good versus evil. I don't think it's that simple. I think there is a harmonization, and we're looking at two different spectrums of that harmonization. I think there's a bigger picture here, or a frequency that we interpret as good or as evil, as good or as bad, as a one or as a zero. I think there's definitely more to it. But I refuse to assume that now we're on the right track. Now, I mean, it's the same narrative, right? Jesus is back. He is going to save us. We're constantly looking out for where's the savior. For some, it's Donald Trump. He's the savior. He's going to make everything better. My question is, when are you going to make everything better? We may not have a national platform and access with our finger on the pulse of the government. And I've said this all the time, though. You've access to your family, you've access to your local community. I think that's where our responsibility lies. We have a responsibility to make sure we're better informed, that we're better prepared, and that we're leading the life we want to lead. And that's hard, as they say in the Gnostic texts. Man was thrown out of the garden and thrown in a state of chaos, so he would not be occupied. He could no longer be bothered by matters of the Holy Spirit. We're distracted from that inner voice. That's why I said remote viewing is not a gift, it's our birthright, but we have forgotten about that birthright. Hal Puthoff is a voice that has helped bring that back to us. I think we have that responsibility to face that uncomfortable feeling. Oh, 9/11 might have been an inside job. As a counterintelligence agent, we're trained to question everything and to look at everything with an eye of suspicion. But again, as humans, we all have our bias. We all have our things that back then I was like, no way would the government have knowledge of this and allow it to happen. I think we need to look at that in every one of these scenarios and beyond. The challenge, the challenge is it's easy to go down that rabbit hole and then become corrupted on the other side, to be so negative that everything is bad. And now I need to again make war. That might not be the answer. I have said for years, it doesn't have to be this or this. We don't necessarily have to fight anything. Maybe we just need to do something differently. And that's where the consciousness piece comes in. That's the piece I think that they, in quotes, don't want us to really focus on and know about, because that's where I believe our true power lies. One of the things that Hal Puthoff mentioned in his conversation with Joe Rogan, they were talking about consciousness and how he stated that he's working on some kind of quantum level communication. He didn't elaborate on that. I think that's going to be a game changer in using some kind of technology to communicate quantumly. But he said that the mind, the human body is naturally designed to detect quantum signals. Now we're talking about remote viewing. I'm not an expert by any means in any of this, but talking about remote viewing. As a remote viewer, we have the ability to gain access to information on anything in time and space. I can go look at something that happened 2 million years ago. I can go look at something that happened, a million years in the future, possibly with the future stuff. There's variables there. I'm sure there are limits there, but time and space are not the barrier we believe that it is when you bring remote viewing into it. When you start to understand, and I don't understand it, but I understand this basic premise of it, quantum entanglement, the idea that particles are connected and they can share information instantaneously, sometimes almost it seems precognitively, regardless of how far apart they were. And then you start to recognize that the model we were shown as kids of an atom with a ball of electrons orbiting it is not accurate, but that the electron exists in a field of superposition around the atomic structure. That means that there is this electron field around every single atom on the planet, which means it's an electromagnetic field of communication entangling everything. Whitley Strieber's book, The Key, as I wrote about in my book, Food for the Archons, talks about a sense organ that exists electromagnetically as a part of your central nervous system that is in quantum superposition and can have that access to everything in the universe, in this universe. These abilities are real. Where I was going with this is Hal talked about this thing called microtubules in the brain. And I did a little bit of reading on what these are. And how they could deal with quantum entanglement. So the idea that microtubules within brain neurons may be involved in quantum entanglement, potentially playing a role in consciousness, is a central tenet of the orchestrated objective reduction theory, proposed by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff. This theory suggests that quantum computations occur in microtubules, and that these computations are crucial for processing information and regulating neural activity. And these exists all within the body, all within the brain. So our minds are possibly quantum computers. And for some reason, that signal is severed or pushed back or ignored. I've noticed that as I develop intuitively, psychically as a remote viewer, we strengthen the ability to detect those signals. And just about anybody can do it. But it takes practice and discipline. And it takes time. I believe that is the way forward. We rely on AI a lot now, and that's going to increase. And I think we need to find that balance because we don't want AI to do the thinking for us. And right now, social media already does. We are a social species. As I talked about a few podcasts ago, we go where the tribe's going. We have that focus, we have that attention, we have our tribe, and we don't want to stand out. It's easy to lead us. And that's why I think it's important sometimes we need to unplug and we need to find our way because there's so much noise that we get pulled in with the herd. And it's hard sometimes to stand out when the consequences are very, very big, including death, financial ruin, jail. It's a scary thing. But what's the consequence? Are we actually those frogs that are sitting in a pot of water that's gradually being increased until it reaches a boiling state, but we're not getting out? I do have that worry. And I think I just gave a lot of talking points here, but I think there's a lot of indications of that. So I'm not going to say I'm of the mindset that things are getting better. Do I think the world's going to end and we're all going to die horrible deaths? No. I just did a little bit of a research project, looking at trends. And ultimately, I think we're going through a very rough transition and a lot of things are going to change. I think the new society that will emerge, those people will be okay. They'll probably feel happy. Society will probably be much more efficient than it is right now. By some measures, it will look like a better functioning, happier society. I do believe that. Does that mean it's the best thing for our current, I'll say, illusion of autonomy right now? Do we really have freedom and free choice? Or is our societies, our civilization being led into another stage, another phase, whether we're being phased out or we're being evolved?